Hello. In this video, I'm going to explain the ins and outs of categorical syllogisms. Categorical syllogisms, if you remember back from previous chapters, a syllogism is going to be any argument that has two premises and a conclusion. A categorical syllogism is going to be one of those that has all, no, or some as the first word of each of those statements. Now, there are some things you need to know about categorical syllogisms. The way we have some rules, what we call standard form, that you have to follow in order to make sure that you've listed these correctly, and that allows us to do some logical manipulations with them. To start with, we name all these terms. The subject of the conclusion is what we call the minor term. The predicate of the conclusion we call the major term. And then the term that appears in both premises, in this case here and here, we call the middle term. Okay, so it's really important that you pay attention to this for just a second here. The minor term is always going to be the term that appears in the subject of the conclusion. The major term is always going to be the term that appears in the predicate of the conclusion. The middle term is the only term that appears in both premises. Now, the premise that has the major term in it is the major premise. Okay? And the term that has the minor term in it, the premise that has the minor term in it is called the minor premise. Now, notice that they're listed in a particular order here. I've listed the major premise first and the minor premise second. When you put a categorical syllogism in standard form, you start by identifying the conclusion. Then identify what the minor term and the major term is by that. Then you find the premise that has the major term in it and list it first. Find the premise that has the minor term in it, list it second. And now you have a categorical syllogism in standard form. So just to repeat, a categorical syllogism in standard form has the major premise listed first, the minor premise listed second, and the conclusion listed last. To repeat that point about the minor and the major terms, because this is one that tends to confuse people. It's simple, but people tend to forget it for some reason. The minor term is going to be the subject of the conclusion. The major term will be the predicate of the conclusion. And then you just have to find the premises that have the major and the minor term in them to identify the major and the minor premises. Now, as soon as you have that identified, you can identify what we call the mood in the figure. The mood of a categorical syllogism, the mood of the categorical syllogism is just the letter names for the categorical propositions listed in the order they appear. So the major premise is listed first, and it's an A. The minor premise is listed second, and it's an I. And the conclusion is listed third, and it's an I. So this syllogism is what we call an AII. Okay? It's an AII for its mood. Now, we can also identify what we call the figure. And the figure is going to require you to memorize something here. Let me erase this for a second. Now, if you take the possible positions of the middle term, the middle term could appear, and let me get a fun color for this. The middle term could appear in the subject of the major premise like you see here. Okay, so that would put the predicate, the major term, over in the predicate position of the major premise. And then appear in the subject, or the predicate. I'm going to erase this. Do this again. And then appear in the predicate of the minor premise. Okay, and that's what we call figure 1. Okay? So this has the major term here and here. That makes it figure 1. So this is an AII figure 1. Now it's possible that your middle term appears in the predicate of the major and the predicate of the minor. Okay? And that would be what we call a figure 2. It could be that the middle term appears in the subject of both the major and the minor premises. And that would be a figure 3. Figure 4 is the only other possibility. Notice here we have the middle term in the subject of the major and the predicate of the minor. It could be in the predicate of both. It could be in the subject of both. Or it could be in the predicate of the major term and the subject of the minor term. And that would be figure 4. Okay? Now, the way to remember these figures is something's very simple. This is the way I memorized it at the time when I learned this, was to think of this as a shirt collar. You notice how a shirt collar goes like this, right? And the middle term lies on the edge of the shirt collar. Figure 1, it lies on the downsloping edge. Figure 2, it lies on the the vertical line of the shirt collar. Figure 3 on the other vertical line of the shirt collar. And then figure 4 has it on the edge going up again. Now, one way to distinguish these two, you want to keep these two straight, is remember that the middle, or that the major and the minor are appearing on the collar. They're not appearing in the center on the tie. Okay, imagine that I had a tie on. I'm not wearing a tie. They don't go on the tie. But don't switch these around by putting the major term and the minor term here, major term, minor term here for figures 2 and 3 respectively. Okay, so the way this works out then, you've got, in this case, an AII figure 1. If this had changed, let's say instead of an AII, suppose we had an EI. So now this becomes an AEI. And suppose the middle term wasn't here, but instead was here. So now the figure changes and it becomes figure 2 because the middle term is on the predicate position, in the predicate position of the two of the major and the minor term. So you've got get my right color here, an AEI figure 2. Okay? So, just to rehash here, you want a categorical syllogism is an argument that has two premises and a conclusion. Every one of them is a categorical proposition, so it's an A, E, I, or O statement. The minor term is in the subject of the conclusion. The major term is in the predicate of the conclusion. The major premise is the premise that has the major term in it. The minor premise is the premise that has the minor term in it. The middle term is in both. When you put it in standard form, you're going to list the major premise first, the minor premise second, and the conclusion last. Then as soon as you have that, you can identify the mood, in this case A, E, I. It could have been, before I had an A, I. We could change this and end up with you could put a sum here, and then you have an I, E, I. Okay, so the mood is the order of the letter names for the categorical statements. And then the figure is the position of the middle term. If the middle term appears here and here, that is a figure 1. If it appears in the predicate of both statements, it's a figure 2. The subject of both statements is a figure 3. And over here, you have the middle term in the predicate of the major premise and the subject of the minor premise.